Editor Katherine and Colin.
In that order.
I have neither. I had neither. I didn't know they had one. How did I not know?
But started the paper today that they just got these federal funding.
Yeah, for like more than 2 million, like 2.8 million.
That's awesome. I guess to make this all the way it once was.
Yeah. Make it fancy.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Very cool.
It's really neat. Yeah.
Historic building. You have like a regular partnership now with them? So for the, oh, sorry. Yeah.
I guess my fear is that people wouldn't show up were completely unfounded.
Yeah. See, it's all like weather.
Tough Mainers.
Concerned that they were gonna be talking to an empty room and everybody would be on the live stream, there'd be nobody here because of the weather, but
That's kind of what I
did
thought,
people?
Yeah.
because
It looks
it
like
doesn't look good out
unstoppable.
there.
Saturdays ago during that storm. And
Uh-huh.
all the scholars showed up.
So you
from
can
all the
predict
counties.
storms basically based on when we
Based on
schedule
that.
events.
So, all your fans are here.
It's great.
Oh, yes.
Hey, how's it going, man? I was just thinking about you. I wonder where David is these days. Like, hey, Colin Woodard, how are you?
Nice to meet you.
Are you still in Yarmouth? Where are you these days?
Scarborough.
Oh my gosh, Southerners.
Very,
Southerners, yeah, it's not real bad, but anyway. Dan's been there for many years and I've been there for a few years.
You still have the boat and cruise and all that good stuff?
I've got a little boat.
Not the big
Oh,
one.
well,
Yeah.
it could be.
What do you have?
18 and a half foot, eight-story type of-
Oh, yeah, I know. You take, I thought they were 19 and a half. No?
I mean, there is an element.
Oh. My dad and I used to borrow those. We did a couple week-long cruises when I was about 13 or 14 with the Cape Dory Typhoon, you know.
Tight quarters.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, you got to be a son and dad camping kind of thing. You have to
That's it.
take all the stuff out of the cabin, put a tarp over it. They're hardy, but not as hardy as one would like when the weather gets harsh.
You just put my phone
He
in
has a
in your.
Pearson Ensign now.
Yeah,
The
do
difference
that.
between those two is substantial. Yeah.
Well, you seem to be thriving.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah. I took this, the American Nations books and founded a think tank project down in a university in Rhode Island that
Good.
we're doing data journalism and, polling and changing the world kind of thing. We'll talk about it a bit
I
here.
hope you changed it. Well, that's it. Good
I
job.
know, failing in that. Yeah, just trying to change it a few percent because in a tight world, a few percent can be the difference between collapse and not. So.
Oh, my, finish the story for internal.
Single-handedly, you're taking down
They're
everything.
good stuff for them. They asked me to do a piece on Sears Island,
Really excited about this whole house.
The topic that keeps on giving.
that's exactly it. I mean, the list of projects.
I think,
Goes on and on.
yeah, like I wrote a whole
Stories.
script out,
There's potential there, but
like
somehow we never
complete
quite
sentences.
figure out how to do
I
it.
wrote- yeah. Well,
I'm
you should.
done with it. That's it. I had fun. Who's happy?
I hope it works.
Yeah. I think the last time I reported on that was
Oh, yeah,
7,
yeah.
8 years ago, and it was like, the feds wanted to dredge and then
Overseas.
dump all the dredging off Islesboro and like some kind of prime lobster, like nursery ground or something like that. Yeah,
Mine too.
See happy.
yeah.
Mine is like
Islesboro
really,
was angry. Well, good seeing you. Thanks for coming. Braving the free storms.
Mexico got a crowd.
I know, we're party Mainers.
Thank you.
Hi, Colin.
you should get.
Could I get you
Oh,
some?
absolutely, for sure.
I'm gonna hear him talk about it first.
Yeah. they're gonna
Would
see
you
if
like
it's
it
worth it.
autographed or personally signed to someone?
Just my friend.
All right. Here, if you want, I usually put it right here. Is that good?
They're all his fans.
Oh my gosh.
Great.
So,
good for you.
my wife
I-
said
I'm-
this
I think this is
was
perfect.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for getting for it.
It's.
Maddie is Maddie.
I
I know you don't, you prefer to.
I
be
really
on
would
screen.
prefer to them.
Well, listen, this is gonna.
I was not given that option.
It's a new world.
Excellent. Yeah, there's a
I
few
don't like
down there.
That's great.
Believe it or not, I lived in Texas for a year and a quarter. I had a Texas license plate and driver's
We're in
license. I
defense
lived
business.
outside Brown.
I know we're.
Well, I
Oh,
learned.
yeah, you will. Oh, God.
I did, yeah. Actually, Port Isabel, technically.
Oh my gosh, nice.
Yeah. Fascinating place, yeah.
Eventually, I went to the first person that tended down the library.
Texas Brownsville.
I think I walked in here once,
Oh,
just to check out the library, but they were closed at the time, so I think I'm just like.
Yeah.
I don't.
oh, did you?
Membership on the government and
Oh, yeah, sure.
What do you get for a membership?
Yeah, kind of like the book working, you can use the library.
Yeah,
Here, I think.
It's,
Okay.
it gets around a bit in college and some,
For a little
I
while.
know
was
some
like,
high schools have done it, but yeah. It keeps popping up here and there, yeah. Wayne Fleet has it in Bridgeport curriculum right now, yeah.
not supposed to be taken
That would be nice, yeah. I actually took for Lobster Coast, a book about me, and the new edition, my wife went out, I said, you know, the only swear word, the F word, is on page 3 of the book, and that's the only one in the whole book. It's in a quote from Andy Lobsterman. It's like, you know, that probably stops all your scholastic sales, so we actually changed it to
How long?
asterisk
Now?
as a new edition, so now we can get into the public school.
90 minutes. I was not told that I
Yeah,
might have.
but it might be just enough to cause trouble
So
in a,
he's,
you know, because it would link
He
the book,
did-
but it comes
he
up
did-
immediately.
he has a 30-minute presentation. And then I've got a bunch of questions and I'm hoping we'll take up 30, but if I run out, then we'll just go to questions.
Yeah.
And I think we're gonna try and,
This is the book.
Yeah.
Cedric designed. So I think it's also the latest.
Union is the latest.
Oh, you're joking.
I mean, you could trade if you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind
Not
of
the
the
United
basis.
Methodist,
These, this one
Comma
and
South.
Union
Right.
are kind of the two that he rips off of.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello.
Siobhan, Brad, we met ages ago.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I thought you looked familiar. Yeah, we had assigned desks next to each other and I was never at mine.
That's right. I call this the teacher pupil dynamic where all the pupils know the teacher, but the teacher can only remember so many.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'll get that next essay to you hopefully next week on the Lobster Coast stuff.
Please.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't you owe us a few columns?
Yeah, well.
I'm Julia. I'm
Hey,
city editor.
Colin, how are
Nice
you?
to meet
Pleasure to meet you. What is he a designated survivor in case
Good evening. Look at all of you warriors on an evening of incredibly rude spring storm. Thank you all so much for coming out and for being here. My name is Annie Lee. I am the executive director here at McCann's Hall. How will have you? Just a little bit about McCann's Hall for those of you who don't know. In 1815, the Maine Charitable Mechanic Association formed to support Maine's creative community. They were blacksmiths, coopers, artists, innovators, and creators. Between 1857 and 1859, they built this beautiful building, McCann's Hall, right here in Portland, as a communal gathering space with a library at its center. And I know so many of you got to spend a little bit of time in the library, which is the 8th oldest member-supported library in the United States. So quite a treasure for us to have here. Our mission is to make knowledge, ideas, and the arts accessible, and to ensure that our historic building remains a vibrant cultural resource for the arts and communities. That first part about knowledge and ideas is exactly what we're doing here tonight. Mechanics Institutes were founded with the promise that the quote, diffusion of useful knowledge makes us better and inspires humanity and builds community. And that last part about our building, we are really celebrating it this week, as we may have read in today's Portland Press Herald. Mechanics Hall was just awarded $2.86 million from the federal government to support the very first step in the full restoration of this building. It will replace our historic clear story roof and even weatherproof the whole building. So it's very exciting and we're celebrating a lot. It's a game changer for the arts and communities here in Maine. So I'm thrilled that this announcement comes on a night that is our very first collaboration with our friends and partners at Maine Trust for Local News. As a former journalist, I know firsthand that an investment in local news is critical to the future of democracy. So we should all be so grateful for their investment and what the work that they're doing here for us in Maine. So thank you so much to the Maine Trust. Lisa DeSisto, CEO and publisher of the Maine Trust for Local News, to introduce our guests and to thank our sponsors for the evening. Lisa.
Thank you, Anne, and how exciting to be here on the day when your grant was announced with $2.8 million. I was saying, you're the buckets though, that should be more holes in the roof, but we're thankful that they are not, and excited to see this building restored to its original glory. How many people are here for the first time tonight? So wow, so this is work. This is work that's spreading through this. So it's also my first time, and I look forward to more collaborations with Annie and the staff here. So as Annie mentioned, look at everyone. We never for a second considered canceling tonight, and we appreciate the a couple weeks ago, we hosted the Maine State Spelling Bee at Bowdoin College, where spellers from the middle school spellers from 14 counties in Maine came to compete for the chance to represent Maine at the Scripps National Spelling Bee. That day was a disaster weather-wise. Everyone showed up. Spellers were locked in and ready to go. So we know how to deal with winter, even if it's April, right? So as you know, our newspaper group became part of the nonprofit National Trust for Local News in August. And I have to say, on behalf of our 400 employees and all of our subscribers that are here tonight, we couldn't be more thrilled to be part of this national movement focused on sustaining local news to preserve our democracy.
So thank you for being part of this. And I also wanted to thank our sponsor, Murray Plum and Murray, for making this event possible. In addition to our subscribers, we really appreciate the support of the business community in advancing our efforts. Now, one thing I am a little bit sad about is that Colin Woodard left us a year ago. And exactly. And it's been a year filled with lots of good news for local journalism, but this is what I'm just really struggling with. But I am thankful that he is here to share his wisdom. And every time we have Colin for an event, we pack the house. So thank you, Colin, for being with us. So let me introduce Katherine Lee, who is the Press Herald web editor. She is going to wrangle the conversation tonight with Colin Woodard, who was our former state and national affairs writer, and now heads up the Nationhood Lab at Salve Regina Health Center for International Relations and Public Policy. The topic tonight: should America stay together? The collapse of the Republic and the Federation isn't just possible, it could be imminent. Welcome, Colin and Katherine.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight and missing the pre-game, pre-storm show. Mainers are hardy, so I'm glad to see the full house despite it all. And thanks to the Press Herald and Mechanics Hall for having me. This is my first time speaking at Mechanics Hall, and I only visited briefly. It's wonderful that you have the money to restore this place, and I'm thrilled to be joining you. I left the Press Herald to found Nationhood Lab, a think tank project based at the Pell Center at Salve Regina University, which is down in Newport, Rhode Island. I still live here. There, I study and write about the problems of US nationhood and how to solve for them, broadly speaking. And from that, I wanted to share two things with you tonight: on the state of US politics and society, and the stability of our democracy here at the dawn of a frighteningly high-stakes election cycle, at a time when the United States' revolutionary experiment in democratic self-government remains imperiled to a degree not seen since the 1860s. First, I'm going to give an explanation for why it is that the US, despite its obvious and myriad advantages, has for much of its existence been divided against itself and thus vulnerable to collapse. Secondly, to draw your attention to a key stratagem we've been working on at Nationhood Lab that can help hold us together against the forces of autocracy that threaten to bring down the Republic and shatter the Union. Now, I'll discuss more about that in a few minutes, but to really understand the situation today, I want to offer what I hope will be some helpful deep background on the fundamental characteristics of the US Federation, characteristics that make our country more structurally vulnerable than many of its liberal democratic peers. First among these is the fact that the United States is not really a nation state at all. We're rather a collection of stateless nations, each with their own intents, ideals, and story of national purpose. These regional cultures, which don't respect state or even international boundaries, have never been in agreement over the big questions in American life. What is the proper role of government? The proper relationship between church and state, and even the meaning of such key words in the American lexicon as freedom or liberty. These stateless nations, these regional cultures, go back to the beginning of European conquest and settlement, to the 17th and early 18th centuries. The original clusters of colonies were settled by people from distinct regions of the British Isles and from France and the Netherlands and Spain, each with their own religious, political, and ethnographic characteristics. Each was first colonized at a separate time and under a different political model. Some of these regional cultures championed individualism, others utopian social reform. Some embraced a specific Anglo-Protestant identity, I'm looking at you, Greater New Englanders, others ethnic and religious pluralism. Some valued equality and democratic participation in politics, others deference to an aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. The Puritan project in New England, for instance, had very little in common with the neo-feudal aristocratic society of the Chesapeake country, or with the Dutch commercial colony encompassing what is now Greater New York City, or New Spain's far-flung northern frontier, or the West Indies-style slave society planted in the deep southern lowlands by English planters from Barbados. For generations, these distinct Euro-American cultures developed in remarkable isolation from one another, cultivating and consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and expanding across the eastern half of the continent in nearly exclusive settlement bands. They saw themselves as competitors for land, for settlers, for capital, and even as enemies, taking opposing sides in the English Civil War of the 1640s, in the American Revolution, in the War of 1812, and of course, in the US Civil War. Here, by the way, is a map of the Spanish colonization of the Southwest. These are the areas actually settled by the Spanish prior to the US annexations. The point I'm making is there's never been one America, but rather several Americas. And today, there are 11. To see their effect, you need to use county level data. So these are them mapped at county level resolution. Now, there isn't time tonight to describe all of them to you now and their various characteristics, but suffice to say that they've always been divided on the key issues with profound effects on American history and society and politics. Now, before we kick off with that, a word on what this map you're looking at represents, right? These are settlement patterns like you saw on this previous slide. So to illustrate, take Yankeedom, the greater New England cultural space, right? Yankeedom began with the Winthrop fleet coming in the 1630s to Massachusetts Bay, right? They landed there, they believed themselves to be a covenanted people like the Old Testament Hebrews, and that God had charged them with specific tasks in the New World, in the New England wilderness, to build a more perfect society as they understood it through John Calvin. And they set forth to do that. They believed that they would be punished or rewarded as a group for their actions. So what everybody did was of great importance to everybody else. And they came in sort of collective community institutions, deploying themselves in the landscape, on the frontier around, a town common, a town green with a meeting hall on one end and a taxpayer financed public school on the other, because everyone for theological reasons needed to learn the Bible. Boom, right? Not your individuals in their log cabins on the frontier kind of image, a very different model. And they were very successful. They quickly annexed the old colony of the Pilgrims on Cape Cod, and then the neo-feudal royalist society set up by Sir Ferdinando Gorges up here in Maine. They pulled New Hampshire and Connecticut by some force and coercion into their orbit. And then they started spreading westwards. With the defeat of the Dutch in the 1670s, the colony of New Netherland became the province of New York. And there was a problem with that when that came up, in that, you remember in your grammar school and junior high school textbooks, when you'd see a map of the 13 colonies, right? The colonies would look more or less like the 13 corresponding states today, except a whole bunch of them would have this strip as wide as the colony that ran all the way to the Pacific Ocean, right? What's up with that? Well, hey, we own between these two rivers and all the way to the next ocean. We don't know where it is, but wherever it is, we own everything, in a Connecticutian wide strip all the way out to the next ocean. Turned out to be a lot farther away than they thought. But because this was written in their charter, when New Netherland became New York, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts said, hey, we own a Massachusettsian wide strip all the way through upstate New York of millions and millions of acres. It should be ours. Well, they lost that battle because New York was named for the Duke of York, the king's brother, and it was his personal province. So sovereignty remained with the Duke of York and later king. But by way of compensation, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts received land title to these contested zillions of acres of upstate New York. And the Commonwealth endorsed land companies who went and deployed New England-style villages, usually led by a Congregational Presbyterian minister leading his flock from a specific town to another town, to deploy these New England-style villages all through this vast strip of upstate New York, which is why so many of the old towns in all of those places in upstate New York look a lot like those in New England. Fast forward another generation, you can see that blue strip going through Yankeedom. Fast forward another generation when the Northwest Territory was carved up by the federal government to create the Ohio Territory and the future state of Ohio. And this whole process was repeated again. Because Connecticut said, wait a minute, we own a Connecticutian-wide strip of this territory. And we call it the Western Reserve of Connecticut. It's that dark blue bit against Lake Erie you see up there. Federal government made the same compromise. No, it's going to not be Connecticut, it's going to be Ohio. But you, the Commonwealth of Connecticut, get land title, and they deployed their own settlement companies. So the Western Reserve was settled by Yankee New Englanders, and only the Western Reserve. The other parts of Ohio were settled in very different fashions. If you look on your Rand McNally Atlas or in your Google Maps, you'll notice that in the Western Reserve, a lot of the place names will be the same as place names in Connecticut, which is no accident because that's where the settlers came from. Fast forward another generation with the creation of the Michigan Territory, and many of the first settlers came from the Yankee settled Western Reserve of Ohio, the Yankee settled upstate of New York, or New England itself, which supplied 5 of the 6 initial territorial and state governors. It's Yankee New Englanders who came and assembled to write the territorial, agreements for statehood, to convene to create the state constitution, the institutions and cultural norms and ideas of who we are and what we're supposed to do, what the good life is about. All the stuff that anthropologists describe as culture were carried by that first settlement group. And bolstered, by the way, by zillions of Mainers from the interior of Maine, because that's where industrial logging in the 19th century fashion had been developed. And all these Mainers were deployed to the new Michigan forests to do the same in Michigan. Then repeat the process in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So what you're seeing there is a settlement map of where this particular New England-derived settlement stream were the ones who were the first effective settlers, as the cultural geography paradigm goes, and therefore sort of formatted the hard drive, leaving down the attitudes and stuff that make up culture, which the rest of us had to deal with as sort of a fait accompli in the air. You can modify it and stuff, but it's the metronome behind which this functions, which is why you have separate regions, why the North and the South are different. Well, there's multiple Norths and multiple Souths when you really get down to it, but that's where culture comes from. So I could tell you a similar story about each one of these regional cultures on the map, but that's what I'm mapping is settlement streams, and let the rest of everything fall as it will thereafter. And as you'll see, it falls pretty remarkably thereafter. Now, when you have a group like that, right, the Puritans there, they don't see eye to eye with the other regional cultures, right? The area that's Greater Appalachian was settled not by these New England Puritans, but by Scots-Irish from the war-torn borderlands of England, the lowlands of Scotland, the English Marches, and Ulster, places where governing institutions were weak or non-existent. And when the government showed up, it was usually in the form of a bunch of guys with lances trying to mow down your family. You had to protect your kith and kin yourself because no one else was going to do it for you. Nothing good would come of government and institutions. We know from experience. A place that prized individual liberty and personal autonomy and was extremely skeptical from experience of governing institutions of any kind from county on up. And they came into southwestern Pennsylvania, the top of that fire engine red area, and then spread down in 2 settlement drives on each side of the Appalachian Mountains, one down the Great Wagon Road into the uplands of the South and onto the Ozarks of Texas Hill Country, the other rafting down the Ohio River, starting in Kentucky and settling much of the lower Midwest, right? Skeptical of shared institutions and communitarian projects, which are precisely what the Yankee experiment, going back to the Covenant, was all about. Imagine having a country where these 2 regional cultures and a whole bunch others beside had to govern together. Therein lies the trick. It's incredibly difficult to do that. For instance, these kind of societies don't agree on how to create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free. That's the American experiment. How do you do it? Do you emphasize individual liberty, as the Scots-Irish did, or the common good, like the Puritans did? So which is it going to be? Our politics, up until 2016 anyway, centered on this question, which is why you see this map reflected in so many other county level maps, like election results. Oh, yeah. Here's the The elections, you can see, if you break it down by county, you can't look at red state, blue state, because the regional cultures didn't respect state boundaries. You got to look at the county level. And when you do that, you can see the results pop up like that, right? You can see that, you know, one party is going for, you know, the whole Yankeedom zone that I just described to you. You can see a mix in the Midlands. You can see the left coast voting in contradistinction to the interior of its own states and provinces. And you can see that when you go down into the deep south and the Tidewater zone, it's all the opposite party. And I didn't mess with the colors. Red really is Republican and blue really is Democrat, because this isn't a recent election. This is the 1916 showdown between Woodrow Wilson and Charles Hughes, which leads you to the 2008 map between Barack Obama and John McCain. 2012 map looks much the same. A few little revisions in 2016, but you can see that essentially it's the same result, only the parties have swapped. Because in that time period, there was pretty much a swapping of the constituencies and the platform and the priorities of the two parties in that intervening period. You'll see a couple changes if you were really looking closely at the 1916 map in 2008. Notice that the Deep South and Tidewater are no longer monochrome one color. And you can see El Norte suddenly appearing on the map where you couldn't really see it before. What changed? Latinos and African Americans could exercise the franchise by 2008, where they couldn't in 1916. So this affects many other things other than just politics. It can also affect how these regional cultures each respond to, say, a contagious, deadly airborne virus. You can see how the individual liberty nations, Midlands, left coast, New Netherlands, right around New York City, and Yankeedom. The individual liberty nations, the Scots, Irish, and Greater Appalachia, the Deep South, Tidewater, and Far West, how those places hobbled the US response to the COVID-19 pandemic, resisting mask wearing and vaccines, mapped here by Nationhood Lab at a nation level as of August 15th, 2021. That was a time when vaccines had been entirely available for a long period of time, freely available for many weeks. And if you wanted to get vaccinated, you could have by then. Some of the communitarian nations, like I just said, Yankeedom, New Netherlands, Left Coast, and so on, had almost twice the per capita vaccination level of the Deep South. And not unrelated, here are the per capita COVID-19 deaths from the previous summer before there were vaccines, the summer of 2020, from the New York Times. Now you see these regional divides in the prevalence of various diseases. Here's diabetes prevalence, which we mapped at Nationhood Lab using CDC data with our academic collaborators at the University of Minnesota and the University of Illinois, Chicago, where we're mapping and explaining various long observed geospatial patterns in various diseases and health indices that happen to tie straight to the regional cultures. As you can see, when diabetes comes, Deep South and Greater Appalachia have a problem. Red is worse, blue is better. That's the percentage of people who actually have it within the whole population. This is life expectancy. As presented in my project and revealed in a Politico story we did last year, we found 3 to 5 year population level differences between the large regions in life expectancy, which may not sound like a lot, but that's the gap separating the US from Bulgaria, Libya, and the Philippines, respectively. And these gaps did not go away when we parsed by race, urbanity, impoverishment, education, and access to healthcare. Little appreciated American life is how much the indices of gun violence, like so many other salient issues in American life, vary by region. Here, again using CDC data, we mapped the per capita rate for gun deaths by county between 2010 and 2020 inclusive. The Deep South's annual per capita rate of 15.6 per 100,000 residents is about double that of Yankeedom and about 4 times that of New Netherlands around greater New York City, despite that being the most densely populated and diverse part of the country, of the continent, whose rate is only 3.8 per 100,000. That's not much higher than Switzerland's. The gaps, by the way, persist or even grow wider if you look at just urban counties to just urban counties between the regions, or just rural ones compared to just rural ones, or just white victims or just Black victims. This was the subject of another Politico story we did last year that became their most read story of the year at their site. When I've shown this image on the internet, the thread typically fills up with comments amounting to, well, this is just a map of where Black people live. Because African-American homicide rates are typically a decimal place higher than for whites, though their suicide rates are less than half the white rate. But to dispel the notion that regional effects are not in fact in play, this is the same exercise, but for whites-only gun deaths. The Deep South's rate is more than double that of Yankeedom's and 5 times that of New Netherland. Not unrelated, here's every fatal white supremacist mob action in the United States between 1835 and 1964, both lynchings and riots as mapped by the Monroe Work Today research group. The orange dots represent an incident where an African-American was killed. The yellow ones are Latino victims. It also profoundly affected 19th century immigration. This, also from the Census Bureau, is the percentage of foreign-born people in each county in 1900. The darker the shading, the more foreign-born people there are. Notice that nobody went to the Deep South, Tidewater, and Greater Appalachia in this period, right? In the great American identity-forming immigration wave of the 1880s through 1920s, nobody went to those regions from that wave, further reinforcing identity and demographic differences. On the key, the areas that are white have no foreign-born population or under 1%, right? And the darkest areas that you see have 30% or more. That's how big the variations were in 1900. This, in turn, affected the distribution of religious traditions today. Here, from the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies and their US religion census, are the dominant religions today in each county. Red is Southern Baptist. You can see a green Methodist belt in the Midlands. Gray is Mormon, and blue is Catholic, which was the largest religious group, the plurality group in that great 1880 to 1924 immigration wave I just referenced. One that was so profoundly changed American ideas about identity, forcing legacy Protestant America, kicking and screaming, to accept that henceforth, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, at least, would be full-fledged Americans too. Except that process never happened in the southern regions. That Baptist zone you see there on the map is the legacy of the spatial distribution of that great immigration wave a century ago, right? The only part of the country where Christian nationalism, the notion that America is rightly an evangelical Protestant nation and should be governed as such, can find fertile soil, because it's obviously not the case if you live anywhere else. But it appears to be the case if you're in those regions. Here is a detailed crowdsourced map of American dialects today by the internet researcher Rick Ashman. He basically asked people, hey, come to my website, tell me what your zip code where you live, and then speak this script and send me the sound file. And then, they did their diphthongs and all that linguist stuff, and they tracked everybody. And today, the blue lines are the major groupings between the different dialects now. Not 400 years ago, not 300 years ago, but still today. And you can see to an incredible extent how much the way people speak follow those same settlement lines, which, when you think about it, kind of makes sense. And to my surprise, it even affects genetics, right? American Nations is entirely about culture, not genetics. But this study, which came out in 2017, 6 years after I wrote American Nations, in the journal Nature Communications, had scientists from Ancestry.com, right? The people who, you put the Q-tip in your nose and they tell you, you're not in fact Lithuanian, surprise, that's not your dad. If you check the box that said, you can use this for research, they did. They rolled all of those genomes into a computer, and the computer sequenced the entire genome and then looked at every other genome on the map. There were like 700,000 of them at the time they were researching this study, to just look for unexpected relationships in reproductive clustering. And because it's Ancestry.com, they have your genealogy from your gene sample, so they know who your paternal great-grandparent was, where they were born, and when they died, and they were able to map it backwards in time. And these are the reproductive clusters they found. They didn't know anything about American Nations. I interviewed them after the study came out, but you can see to a large extent, Even the decision about who's going to marry who ended up following the regional culture trajectories. And you can see on the Greater Appalachian movement splitting on the two sides of the mountain, which makes sense between the Great Wagon Road and the Ohio Valley groups. So the divides are real, they're persistent, and they matter. So that brings us to Act 2, the second question. What holds us together? What's ever held us together, given all of this? Because the regional cultures, the 6 Eastern ones anyway, wound up together by an accident of history. They came together in 1776 to face off a common threat, a change in British imperial policy that threatened to destroy their relative autonomy in each one of these individual political and social systems. To stave off this threat of homogenization and centralized rule, they together formed a joint military command in the form of the Continental Army, a treaty organization, the Continental Congress, which had to move across the map as the front line shifted from place to place. And miraculously, they won. And they found themselves inside something called the United States. But nobody was quite sure what that really was. The United States of America came into being as a contractual agreement, a means to an end for the parties involved. Nobody at the time thought that they'd created a nation state in the sense that Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France were. They all knew that its people lacked a shared history, religion, or ethnicity, that they didn't speak a unique language that was all their own, that they hadn't occupied the continent long enough to have a sense of dwelling in some sort of mythic homeland since time immemorial, and they'd in fact killed and pushed out the very people who had such a claim. In fact, were still doing it. They lacked a shared political heritage apart from the imperial ties they had just revolted against. And they had no shared story of who they were and what their purpose was. In short, they had none of the foundations of a nation state, no story to bring and hold them together. That story had to be created decades later, starting in the 1830s, really, a story I tell in my most recent book, Union. It's the one thing that has held us together, more or less, ever since, but it's been contested, this story, from the outset. Today, the regional fissures are having a corrosive effect on that story, a shared loyalty to the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence, the inherent equality of humans, their rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and representative self-government. And when those ideals are under assault, the US has very little to fall back on. This is a very important point. The fate of the Republic and the Federation are one and the same. If the Republic falls, the Union will collapse. Now, such stories are required for every nation, be it Germany or Hungary or Japan or ourselves, because as individuals, to have fealty to something as abstract as a nation, to feel that we owe it greater loyalty than to others, that we're bound to its fellow members more than to people who are not members of the group, that we might ultimately give our lives for it, that requires a compelling and credible story, an idea that's evocative and feels true on some level, that has footings in the past and gives us an answer for why we're together. A society without a credible story, the historian William McNeill wrote 35 years ago, soon finds itself in deep trouble. For in the absence of believable myths, coherent public action becomes very difficult to improvise or to sustain. So the story of United States nationhood, of what the country's purpose was and who belonged and where it came from and where perhaps it ought to be going, had to be created ex post facto. And by the time we really got around to doing it in the 1830s and the 1840s, there were already two stories competing with one another for this right. Two stories of America that could not coexist. A contest over identity and purpose that has continued to this day. One story said, yes, we may lack a shared history, religion, or ethnicity, but what we share are this set of ideals, the ones I mentioned before from that famous passage in the opening statement we made as a people, the Declaration. To be an American, this story goes, is to be committed to this set of propositions about the nature of the universe. In this tradition, first packaged and promoted by a Massachusetts Yankee, Historian statesman George Pancroft, he of Worcester, Phillips Exeter, and Harvard, who in the 1830s put together and packaged this for the first time for a general public and launched it out into the ether and the media universe of the time. Now, he wasn't just a ivory tower intellectual thinker historian. He actually participated in events. He was Secretary of the Navy and the Polk administration. He's the guy who came up and founded the Annapolis Naval Academy. He's the person who gave the orders to the naval captains that resulted in the annexation of California. He served as Secretary of War, later as our ambassador in the United Kingdom and to Germany. He was a big deal back in his age and the most influential historian of the 19th century. Bancroft, in his histories, very successfully argued that America's purpose was to create a society dedicated to those ideals in the Declaration, to making them a reality, and that Americans' purpose was to fight for those ideals and for one another being able to secure them. Now, these are pretty good ideals. A natural right given to humans by God or nature, or as the Declaration says, nature's God, to survive, to not be tyrannized, to pursue our happiness as we understand it, and to have equal access to the representative self-government that makes that all possible. And that we're in a covenant as Americans to protect one another's rights to these things. These are the ideals that Frederick Douglass fought for in every speech he gave. This is Lincoln at Gettysburg and MLK at the Mall. It's our civic national ideal, the American promise. But it was contested immediately in the 1830s by a counter-narrative crafted by a circle of Southern intellectuals who said, no, the Declaration is wrong. Humans are not equal. In fact, only the Anglo-Saxon race, they argued, had the genius and ability to secure the promises in the Declaration. We're a classical republic, they argued, like ancient Greece and Rome, where a minority at the top have the privilege or liberty to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery are the natural lot of the many. It was ethno-national and inherently an authoritarian vision. The battle between these two versions of America has been our eternal struggle. This was the fight throughout the antebellum period, in the Civil War and Reconstruction. The ethno-nationalists actually ruled this country pretty much uncontested with a federation-wide coalition in the 1910s and 1920s, when the first deep Southern president, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the federal government, when they were putting up Confederate statues that we're now tearing down, and when Birth of a Nation was all the rage. Yes, the film that started Hollywood, it was a film whose plot was celebrating the Ku Klux Klan's successful terrorist campaign to restore white supremacy in the occupied South. When the 1924 Immigration Act imposed racial quotas explicitly to defend the Anglo-Saxon character of the country. The civic national vision only triumphed for the first time federation-wide in the 1960s, not the 1860s, the result of mass mobilizations in the world wars, the civil rights movements those returning African American and Native American and Latino vets helped spearhead, and the interventions of the federal government at key moments. Because the existence of a formal racial apartheid regime in the American South was providing the Soviets with powerful propaganda to win the hearts and minds of people in the primary battlefield of the Cold War, what we now call the Global South, but was then called the Cold World. And so the civil rights movement toppled Southern apartheid and challenged Northern racism. The feminist movement demanded social, professional, and sexual equality for a gender that comprised the majority of the population. Gays and lesbians fought the police and discriminatory ordinances. Elite colleges began partially dismantling their old boy networks, and public universities rapidly expanded to increase educational opportunities. Congress passed a new immigration law in 1964 that repealed the ethno-national quotas, reopening America's gates to humanity at large. And a new generation of historians challenged the neo-Confederate narrative of American history that had dominated scholastic textbooks for half a century, while dispelling the innocence of the American colonization of the continent. And so the civic national narrative returned to the fore. And that's when we became a liberal democracy, in living memory. The point is that it's not inevitable. It's an incredible gift and achievement. that had to be fought for and continues to be fought for. Because the forces of autocracy and ethno-nationalism are on the march. And they have their narrative, their story of what kind of country they're fighting for, all worked out. Make America great again, like it was before that civic national triumph. We don't have our story worked out. We, the 70 or 80% of Americans who actually don't want to live in that authoritarian world. We have lost our message. We were never that great at talking about what these civic ideals mean in practice, but we stopped even trying after the Cold War. A vacuum opened up and demagogues stepped right in. We need that story now, not only because democracy really is better than dictatorship, but also because the consolidation of an ethno-national authoritarian regime would almost certainly trigger the physical collapse of this federation. That's the work we've been doing right now at Nationhood Lab, the testing, polling, and crafting of an emotive, weaponized American story, the answer to why we should stay together, why we all belong, and where we ought to be going, one that can be used in ordinary conversations and real-world situations, one that can rally that latent supermajority to defend what should have been America's values for all of these past 248 years. We'll be perfecting that story. In fact, the polls have just come back with the first top lines on phase 1, a story of pride and reckoning, of an effort to create a society where all people can be meaningfully free. And we'll be helping deploy it by putting it in the hands of organizations working to reform civic education, to engage Hollywood producers and television showrunners to bring these themes into their creative mix, to help business leaders grapple with what values their institutions really can't do without, to political leaders, Republicans, Democrats, independents, or whatever, as long as they share a commitment to the American experiment, to organizations working in the field to protect the vote, like the 700 chapters of the League of Women Voters, to the 250th anniversary commissions in each and every of the 50 states, tasked with helping commemorate the anniversary of this country and indeed the Declaration itself, and in the hands of all of you. Now you might say, oh, well, you'll never convince everybody, and that's true. There's 10 or 20% of Americans who really are all in on the ethno-national authoritarianism, who genuinely relish the public promises of their leader to assign active duty military forces to domestic law enforcement duties, to pardon convicted insurrectionists and other criminals en masse, a class that would likely include himself, to investigate and jail critics and political rivals on trumped-up charges, to purge the civil service and stack it with people whose loyalty is to him, not the people, the country, or the law, to use the Insurrection Act to crush protesters, a world where reporters, public officials, election workers, and anyone the leader regards as vermin are physically threatened and attacked at his behest, a world where elections will no longer be settled by voters, but by the machinations of the regime. The 10 or 20% who genuinely support this agenda will indeed reject the narrative I propose because they reject the American experiment. And it's true that many more won't listen or hear, committed to their tribal identity, to the safety of an information bubble, or love of the leader. But some will. And to protect democracy in the next few years, in a country sitting on a knife's edge, shifting 5 or 7% of those asleep at the wheel, unaware of the stakes and threat, would be decisive. And in the middle and long term, I'm actually optimistic. I believe we have the wind at our backs, the backs of the omnipartisan anti-authoritarian majority. Because I have Gen Z and Gen Alpha children, and their generations and the millennials are not on board for this authoritarian ethno-nationalism. And as their electoral power rapidly grows in the coming decade, that threat to our country will begin to recede. And we can move on to addressing the core problems that got us there in the first place. So I invite you all to follow our work as it continues to unfold at nationhoodlab.org. And I look forward to my conversation with Katherine and to answering your questions. Thank you very much. Okay.
So I wanted to start out by saying how much I've missed seeing you in the newsroom and getting
Likewise.
to talk with you about the state of American politics. And I'm super excited that I will get to grill you about them tonight. I have a feeling that you all are also sitting on a bunch of questions, so we'll leave some time at the end for you all to come up to the mic and ask a question of Colin. We'll try to wrap it up about 8:30-ish, so everybody can get home before the storm gets really bad. We're journalists, we get a deadline. So I'm going to jump right in with both feet and take you back to 2016. Would you say that that election in 2016 was the trigger for unleashing some of these fracture lines that we have historically had? Or do you think the Trump administration unleashed something brand new?
Yeah, I mean, it's the propellant for sure. And had Trump not been elected in 2016, I don't think we'd be exactly where we are now. But the creation of the landscape and the environment where that was possible has been going on for several decades, right? And my central argument, which is in American character, is that, you know, that effort to create a society where humans can be maximally free is a balancing act, right? There's two ways of doing it. There's the greater Appalachian individual liberty way, you know, the more free the individual is from government and the responsibilities of everyone else, the more autonomy they have, the more freedom they have. Naturally, it has to be axiomatic. The other direction is no, you know, democracy and liberal democracy is an incredible creation. It took 5,000 years of human civilization to create it. It's only possible for individuals to contemplate being free because we've created this gossamer-like thing that makes that possible, that protects the individuals from the rapacious, you know, king, state, power, oligarch, whoever it is, and empowers people to be able to possibly achieve their freedom. And that requires constant reinvestment to cultivate a Republican citizenry, all the leveling mechanisms and things that allow people to function and to achieve their potential from, you know, healthcare and schools and roads and highways and all the rest. So two different ideas, a communitarian one and an individualistic one, but either of those taken to the extreme will lead to tyranny, right? The libertarian one will lead to oligarchy, to, you know, guess the most powerful people, if there are no rules and constraints, the big dogs will eat the little dogs because nothing's stopping them, and they'll maximize their freedom and will take it away from everyone else. In the other direction, if you keep getting more and more of the common good, the keepers of the common good will eventually consolidate that any idiosyncrasy contrary to the plan of the common good has to be punished. They're thought crimes, right? So you have, you know, Orwell on one end and Hitler and Stalin on the other. Those two things, right? There's important elements of both of those elements of freedom. A liberal democratic society is optimized when the two are in equilibrium. And you've got that balance. That's why it's so hard, right? You can't run to extremes. You got to hit the 50-yard line and kind of keep it there. And our problem is we shifted way off the 50-yard line in the past 35 or 40 years in an individual liberty direction that eroded the social contract to the point where there's a stratification not only in income and the income gap, but also in, you know, whether or not you go to jail for committing crime X depends on that. You know, rule of law functions, power functions, tax code, almost everything shifting that way. And as the social contract is broken down, the possibilities of the demagogues stepping in have increased, right? Democracy, meaning the society we're all living in, doesn't seem so great. So people start turning against it, looking for solutions as someone who can solve the mess. So that's how we got here. And in 2016, you know, Trump had an incredible talent and instinct for, you know, he's a classic, you know, right-wing European style demagogue. It's just the US environment and media environment and political class, that wasn't something on their radar. You know, people who've been foreign correspondents and lived in regimes that would collapse recognized all the playbook immediately. But unfortunately, we live in a society that one of our weaknesses is that Americans don't, as a group, have a sense of history or the tragedy of history, or that it can happen here, or in fact, you know, we know it can happen here because it already did in the past, right? But all of that is kind of lost because we're a little bit unmoored. That makes us vulnerable, and so when we got ourselves in a vulnerable situation, and punctuated by, right, 9/11, forever wars, and then especially the 2008 financial collapse, right, discredited all of the pillars of received wisdom all at once, and that's what I'd say 2008 was the final blow that set us up to be in this stage or something.
So let me ask you this. We rely on a system of checks and balances to, protect what you say is a fragile democracy. We're proud of that. We talk about how, well, a president can't govern by fiat. Congress would pass a law and stop that. Or Congress couldn't pass a ridiculous law because the courts would come in and could declare that unconstitutional. So is our system inadequate to meet the current threat? And what would be an alternative?
I mean, I think a lot of political scientists recognize that whatever institutions you have on paper, that's not what matters. It's whether the norms and society follow them. There's a lot of countries that are tyrannies that have constitutions that kind of look like ours. In theory, they're just not followed. So a lot depends on, the Constitution or your legal arrangements or your societal norms don't police themselves. If somebody just goes out and says, oh, I've decided I'm going to stay here as president. I lost the election. I say I won. I'm not going to leave. I say that the electoral ballots sending from the states and legitimate elections confirmed by the courts are wrong anyway. Just run the Capitol. I mean, it's like, no, you can't. That's not part of the game, right? That's the reaction everyone had. If you're not playing by the rules of the game, none of that matters, right? The only thing that stops it is that the rest of us actually push back, that the institutions push back. But we're a long way down the chain, right? We've had a lot of sliding in the defensive norms and stuff for decades, but it's reached sort of a crisis point. And again, the big problem is that most Americans haven't been awake to the threat, and there's also the misinformation bubble, which makes it harder for people to sort out what's going on.
So here's a scary question. What's the worst case scenario? I mean, I've read The Handmaid's Tale. I mean, are you telling us this may be where we're headed?
Worst case scenarios could be pretty bad. I'm optimistic. I actually think we're going to get out of this, but the worst case scenario that is much bigger than the zero chance of it happening is, a authoritarian takeover, round up the courts and, jail your enemies, and that would be maybe a reaction to that. We can't guess exactly what would happen, but you get up in a situation where the federal government and the state government actors both think that they're defending the Constitution and have a legitimate right on their side, and somehow two forces with weapons start interacting in a hot fashion. Then anything could happen, right? You can imagine all kinds of ways. That's the out of control moment. You don't want, little democracies don't end up in those situations because we have norms and no one would ever try to do that. All bets are off in that respect. So in some way, there would be a collapse of the democratic order attended by some level of violence. But the worst case scenarios, you actually have full-on war, military deployed, counter-national guard units, military split between, the whole mess that happens to many countries around the world when things go wrong. Again, I don't think we'll end up there, but it's foolish and naive for people to think that that's not the stakes that we face. This is what we are trying to avoid, and we all have an interest in avoiding. Everyone needs to wake up. Look out at the stories of all other countries, other democracies that have collapsed, and you can see exactly where it can go, and it's not hard to imagine it happening here.
So January 6th was a warning shot?
There have been a lot of warning shots before that. I'd say January 6th was
a culmination.
The first salvo that wasn't a warning shot. Sure. Yeah. And then, there was a moment after January 6th where it seemed like there might be a chance of pulling back, right? There was bipartisan condemnation, and that lasted about 2 weeks before the leaders of the Republican Party were, Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, people who denounced it, that you're done and I'm through with you, McCarthy went down to Mar-a-Lago and kissed the ring, basically. We'll take that back, right? There was a moment, where the country might have been able to right itself, but now we've shifted out of that moment, unfortunately. Think about it. We have one of our major political parties at the national level has now signed on to support a guy who just tried to overthrow an election and the republic, right? He just tried to do that recently under all these criminal charges, and now the Republican National Committee is controlled by his daughter-in-law and hired campaign person who's now being used as a kid to pay for his legal defense for all the crimes that he's accused of committing. I mean, if you were in another country and you read that, what would you think? Think the same here.
So I want to ask you about a recent op-ed that was published this week in the Washington Post. And I think I sent it to you earlier. It's called The Dark Side of Active Citizenship. And it talks about a study that found that the most politically engaged people, the ones who rated themselves highly on their knowledge of politics and engagement and current events, they're the most polarized and intolerant of people in the opposing party. So given that dynamic, how do you get people who hold diametrically opposing viewpoints to come together for a common goal and a unified vision?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's there's a lot of frame out there in the default in the mainstream media class and in the chattering classes is the problem with the country is polarization. You know, what are we polarized about exactly? What are the two camps and why is there a gulf opening between them? And that's, you know, a value statement. One camp has gone all the way out into authoritarianism. That's the problem in the country right at the moment. We can get back to trying to, you know, work together in a bipartisan way after we solve that problem. But right now, that's the real problem that we face. So yeah, people are polarized. If you're really aware of what's going on and you're not really thrilled with MAGA, yeah, you have a lot of reason to be distrustful with people who fully are, because you know what the person they're backing is going to do next, right? So there's some legitimate concern from that. How do we get beyond it? Well, most people, including most Trump supporters and probably a supermajority even in the Republican Party, don't actually want to go down the path that we're heading with that, right? It's just they don't realize or have been led to believe that that's not where it's headed. The trick to sort of bring everyone together is like, beyond all of our other policy disagreements, beyond our disagreements about whether you achieve a free society through individual liberty maximization or more common good communitarian spirit, we can get to all that later. But we should all have the commitment to the American experiment and values of the Declaration. That's something that I really do believe 70, 80% of us put to the test, actually sitting down and thinking about it, would all agree. Once you pull away the partisan coding, oh, I can't say that. I mean, you use that word, and that belongs to the other tribe. But if you get beyond that, you know, it's a supermajority. The number of people who actually want that path is really small. So how do you pull us together? It's pulling together around that central set of ideals that are the normal workings of a liberal democracy, small l, small d. And you know, we got to get back to that. Everything else is just power plays at that point.
So let me play devil's advocate for a minute. You argue for a return to a national story to give us some kind of footing, some kind of commonality to bind us together. But it's pretty clear from your book, Union, that that story of a unified country was not a story that included everybody from the start. So people of color, women, the LGBTQ community, all those voices have been left out historically. So could you argue that the historical ideal really did need to evolve and that this kind of going against it is sort of a course correction that, you know, could eventually include a diversity of voices?
Yeah, I mean, our America in practice towards the American experiment and the ideals as they should be, or Douglas would argue for them to be, and Martin Luther King are two different things, right? Frederick Douglass, every single speech said, check out these ideals in the Declaration. That's what this country is supposed to be about. You're completely failing at them, right? I was a slave. I can tell you firsthand how much you're failing, how it's corrupting your masters and yourselves. You, and by that he meant white people in the North, need to defend those ideals, rally up and defend them for women and Irish people and Chinese and whoever was being attacked in his lifetime, he was defending, right? There's the gap is that there's a gap is clear, and that there was always a gap. But the set of ideals, they're ideals, right? They're the key element that can hold us together and should hold us together. So it is an unfortunate evolution that when people started confronting the fact that the received national story had not included everyone, that it was literally whitewashed, that you know, it lied about the way that Reconstruction went down, or the conquest of the continent, all these big, huge things. And they identified all those things. So scholars started diving and saying, oh, here's the history of these people left out, and these people's voices left out. All important, but nobody then stopped and put it all back together again into a coherent message. Because the ideals of the Declaration, but the whole conversation we have, right, about we ought to be an inclusive and equitable and democratic society where everyone belongs, all of that is predicated on the values of the Declaration. We wouldn't be having that conversation if if it wasn't for those natural rights notions that everybody has an inherent right to those things. So if we care about inclusiveness and living in an inclusive and diverse democracy, you need to defend the ideals first because of the superstructure from which the rest of it falls. So yeah, ideals good, practice bad, and people were right to be cynical and upset with it. But now that we've got it pulled together, we need to cycle it back in. You can't leave the narrative space about a national narrative vacant. When you leave the vacuum, it doesn't stay a vacuum. Somebody steps in, right? Somebody's gonna step in and take over that space, which is what's happened for us. Right, end of the Cold War, we stopped trying to articulate the civic national narrative at all. Right? Hey, it wasn't, liberal democracy defeats authoritarian dictatorship. It was capitalism defeats communism. No free markets. Hey, we don't need to talk about nation states at all. Nations will wither away. Look at the European Union, right? We're free trade, movement of goods and services will solve everything. It's gonna be utopia. I mean, obviously that's not how it turned out, right? Because we're not just, economic people, right? There are all kinds of things that matter to people, and having that, losing our way and not saying who we are, but it's just somehow about GDP and the stock market, that's not a purpose for a people that's going to hold you together. So that was a major mishap that created the space and context where we could get in this much trouble. And then 9/11, forever wars, if you guys know.
So you talk about seeing this dynamic play out in other countries. And I know that you spent some time living and traveling in Europe early in your career, specifically Eastern Europe, during the years immediately after Nicolae Ceausescu was toppled in Romania. Tell us about the parallels that you see between what was happening in Europe during your studies and what is playing out here now.
Yeah, I was studying, I graduated from Mount Aiken Regional High School in Salem Township, Maine in 1987. And so if you work that out, my junior year abroad ended up being in 1989, the fall of 89. And I had been a Soviet East European Studies major, so I was in Budapest, arrived and it was still communism. And while I was there, everything collapsed, the Berlin Wall, and all the rest. So I saw all that firsthand. And then I was like, oh, this is amazing. I got to get back the next summer on a research grant to immediate postgraduate in Romania. And then after I graduated and spent most of my 20s, most of the 1990s in that region where everything was being transformed, right? Efforts to create liberal democracies from scratch where none had existed before, hadn't existed since the 1930s, which had their own problems, and counter movements, right? The arrival of fascist and ethno-nationalist movements that captured many governments, including ultimately Hungary, where I lived a lot of the time. And while I was covering it, Croatia under Franjo Tuđman and the Bosnian War, right? And in different moments throughout this region, ethno-nationalists had seized a chance, right? The transformation from state socialism to capitalism caused enormous pain and disruption to ordinary people's lives, hyperinflation, and losing their jobs and everything else. It was a time of great ferment, and demagogues were always there trying to capitalize it. I can come save you. It's the evil people X, the minority here, or your enemy in a fifth column trying to destroy it. All that stuff reflects it in the 1930s, where some of the older generation of politicians at the time hadn't grown up. It was all kind of happening at once. So what you saw, say, in Transylvania when Ion Iliescu's sort of post-communist, but actually communist heritage, people wanted to hold on to power. You're like, what do we do? Oh, there's the Hungarians in Transylvania. We got to go after them. They're bad, vermin-like people. Milosevic, of course, in Yugoslavia, and what happened in Bosnia. The script of what they said, the language of, I can save you. Here's the problem. Those bad, dirty, stinky disease. All of that stuff. You could see immediately in 2015 and 16, Trump on the campaign trail. He had that down. He's increased the volume on it a lot since then, but it was there already. It's recognized. Here's an authoritarian ethno-nationalist, and this isn't going to turn out. So yeah, it's not a direction you want to go.
So your work right now is focused on convincing people to embrace this American identity that holds true to our founding ideals. Tell us what that work looks like, and what should we be looking for? Like, what's it going to look like on the street in real life for us every day?
Right, we need to hack the zeitgeist to do it, but first we need to know, well, how can you effectively talk about these lofty ideals and declaration? There's all this, 18th century language about, I don't know, what does an actual right to pursuit of happiness mean? I'm not sure. What's equality mean? Start arguing about it. These are not terms that are easy to bring out and just roll out, but not as simple as make America great again, right? Everything's messed up, I will save it, you need to figure out how can you talk about this, because they're powerful, right? The whole message, and that idea that we're all committed to each other's natural rights to survive and to not be tyrannized and to pursue our happiness is a really important idea. How do you talk about that in the real world? Ordinary people in conversation, low information voters. How does that become part of the zeitgeist where we can reflexively know what the country is about? Well, that's a comms exercise. It's like, okay, how is the real way to do this? And is it different in different regions? If you're talking about this in Greater Appalachia, do you frame it differently? Does the sequencing of the argument shift around depending on where you are or other segments in society? The answer is probably yes. But the only way to know that is to go out and do all the work on it. The polling, the focus groups, the qualitative and quantitative stuff, going down to, moral foundations theory and values work, right? People's political opinions they express are based behind them on values that drive those decisions. And social psychologists have worked out the archetypes of the different ways that people are set up. You can sort and examine the electorate and people and sort them into broad archetypes that are more effective for understanding how they're going to behave politically than trying to say, race and income and all that conventional. Test through all those things. So that's what we're doing. We're actually rolling out, actually doing the work of creating a tested strategic comms package around how you talk about this at different lengths, right? Some of it will just be, a 2-sentence soundbite, and some of it will be, a little chunk of a proto speech, but, for the different applications. And we're designing it so okay, by June, we'll finish this process and we'll have answers. Here it is. Here's the map. We know it works. Here's how you talk about it in different regions if necessary. All that will be set. Then how do you deploy it? How do you hack the zeitgeist of a country with 350 million people? Well, obviously, one group can't possibly do that. You have to set it out there in many platforms at once. So the initial move, a lot of the work we'll do in the coming years is about deploying it. But some of the initial moves are through partner organizations who actually need this nugget of who are we as Americans, what is our value and purpose, actually would help propel their work better. There are whole groups tasked with convening across the country to figure out how we reform civic education in the country on a K to 12 and even college. Those organizations, they actually need this nugget to build the narrative around. So they know that we're doing this. We're in conversation with them so that we can hand off something useful to them. There's other groups, like I mentioned in the talk, we're working with business leaders and leading professors at Wharton and Harvard Business School and stuff who carry a lot of weight in the corporate community to talk about, okay, how does a Disney or another company decide where the rule of law and stuff kicks in? Where does it actually matter? How do you sort out that as a business to figure out where the fundamental things, and here's the way to talk about some of that. There's other groups who are interacting with entertainment industry, with Hollywood producers and showrunners who, when the moment comes in their script where they need to say, well, America is about blank, right? What do they say? There you go. And
That's the part that really intrigued me. As
Absolutely.
someone who watches a lot of TV and a lot of movies, tell us what that work looks like. Are you actually talking to Hollywood creatives? Are you
Well,
talking to a showrunner?
we're also network.
Uh-huh.
There are organizations that are doing that, right? That's their whole purpose. Their whole networks and stuff. We're just handing it off to them, and they do that, right? We don't. So we're helping in all these different tiers and spheres, handing it off to the intermediaries who actually can make use of it, including the 250th anniversary commissions in every state, because 2026 is the anniversary of the Declaration in the country, a time when Americans everywhere will suddenly be prompted to think about who we are and what we've accomplished as a people. What are we all about? What's this declaration, whose birthday it is? What was that all about? I mean, it's teeing up this incredible moment. And through the state level commissions, each of which will be tasked with figuring out how to commemorate this. And the state humanities councils alongside will be the ones who actually end up funding the film, the art installation, the talk series, the whatever it is, the museum exhibits, all the stuff thematically it's really, well, what's this all about? All the members of these boards and stuff will ask. And a lot of them won't be experts on history and the political philosophy of the country. There you go. Like, we've come to gift this to you, right? So our job is to sort of network out all those places at once who are force multipliers who can use it in their own work, so that hopefully, ultimately, it just starts percolating through the zeitgeist, unattributed to the Pell Center or Nationhood Lab, but we'll actually see it floating out there being put to use. So that's the model and the idea. So we've been, spent the past year and a half networking into the ecosystem of all the organizations and people who can make use of this, from electeds all the way through to League of Women Voters chapters, to try to figure out how to deploy this in as many areas as possible, make them aware of what we're doing, and put it into their hands all at once.
This sounds a little bit like a PSYOPs operation.
What?
Well,
Yeah,
these subliminal hidden messages that you're sending out there.
I mean, you could say it's propaganda for good in a sense, but so are national narratives in general, right? What's a national narrative? It's a convincing us all of a set of ideas that give us a sense of community to an abstraction. And it's important. We need it, right? We as humans, the way we're built, like evolutionary biology wise, we need to know who we are, right? What identity do I have? What tribe do I belong to? What's the story I tell myself about who I am? And that includes nations. So yeah, I mean, it's a comms exercise and it's a psychological exercise, but so is all that. And this is a really important one. So like I said before, if you don't do anything, then the dark forces will come in and take that and control that narrative, which is what you don't want to have happen.
Can you give us like your ideal scenario, like a message that you would give to, say, a movie director?
Yeah, well, you need the perfected version. The intellectual version is what I threw out to all of you, right? We're tasked with, this covenant with each other to protect our rights, to sort of survive, to live, to not be tyrannized, to pursue our happiness as we understand it, and to access the representative self-government that makes that all possible. How do you really talk about that? Stay tuned in June and we'll talk about how you really boil that down. But those are the key ideas, right? It's a shared enterprise about making a free society and protecting one another's rights to it. So you would, whatever the boiled down talking points are to that, are the ideas that we would hand off to the Hollywood director, whoever else wants to. And it's all public, right? This is a public library shop. We're handing it off to everybody. It's going to be open book in that sense, but we're also trying to cultivate partners who can make use of it very quickly so it gets deployed fast.
So you'll come back in June and tell us what the message is.
We'll write it. We'll set up our main Sunday telegram off and we'll tell you exactly what our results are. So, yeah. It'll be the least secret PSYOPs you've ever seen.
Are you working with the current administration?
No, we don't have any direct links to the current administration. We've, we speak to, like I said, it's by necessity omnipartisan, right? You got to have the Big Ten and everyone who's not down with authoritarian ethno-nationalism. So that includes, I briefed, Senator Collins and Senator King and a variety of others. Majority Leader Schumer had me go down to the Capitol and speak to the Democratic caucus on those things. I've been down to AEI and spoken to them and the Milton Global Conference, and cultivating and linking with like-minded people who are committed to the American experiment across the partisan spectrum and the ideological spectrum. There's a lot of, you talk about this national narrative stuff to Burkean conservatives, they're the ones who get it instantly, right? Because unlike a lot of progressives and Democrats, they're used to thinking about the links in tradition and the past mattering, and they do, right? In a national narrative, all of that story links in really well. So yeah, it's many groups at once, but no, we're not linked in, we're not formally linked in with any party or persuasion because our mission requires it to be a Big Ten. But you gotta be for the American experiment and not for authoritarian ethno-nationalism.
That's the requirement?
The tent does have a door. It's not completely permeable.
Okay. So I think we're going to open it up to questions. I'm going to ask one last question, but if you want to ask one, please line up, I guess, along that wall, and then you can come up to the mic when it's your turn to speak.
I think you got a little too animated with your slides, and
Let's recover it.
yeah. Sorry, folks. This is for the live stream audience, and we lost.
Oh, there it is, right there.
Yeah. You
Sorry,
can imagine
live
this
stream audience.
wasn't picking you up very well. Let me just fix this. Sorry for the interruption, folks. There we go. And you, yeah. There we go.
Hello, live stream audience.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So I've got one last question for you. Obviously, everybody here came here because they were interested in the topic. I presume that we are all interested in knowing more about a democracy and how to save it, because we're aware that it, might be in danger and it is a delicate creature. So what can we do as individuals, as collective, as Mainers, as American citizens?
Yeah. Think about what those values really mean and practice them in the voting booth, in the way you conduct yourself in your communities and society, engage with people, right? That's the big tent and promise. It's a stance, right? Being a Republican citizen is a stance and an attitude about a set of propositions about the world's organized. Think about the Declaration, especially when we get the simplified version that makes more sense and peels away the archaic language. And think about what that means and try to bring it to heart and bring it in as your American identity.
Thanks. I guess I'll turn it over to questions then. Please come up.
Thank you so much for being you and the efforts that you make to fight the fight. But in this work and all the things that you written, is there a time where you think and fantasize it would be like if you could just draw a line through the middle of that?
Snap your fingers.
Give up the rest. And how great a country we would be if we were governing ourselves, because the progress of what we've done in this country, I think, is going to be the anchor of the self and the anchor of these other people who look at this country a different way. And we have succeeded in spite of it. And we were on a trajectory of giving more people freedom, giving more people recognition, and now we're here. So, you ever feel sad about that line? Like, what kind of country we could have if we were just self-governing ourselves with like-minded people?
I mean, the United States, the American experiment wouldn't be what it is without like Greater Appalachia, right? If it wasn't for Greater Appalachia, the whole democracy element in there and the individual mattering and not having a society of like, the inherited educated elite running everything, none of that would have happened. They kind of forced that. That's an essential part of the American character. So we couldn't have done it without other regions, if we think of us as Yankeedom here. And Yankeedom would have been kind of an oppressive, assimilative place that's not geared around actual like equality in the sense that anybody can show up here and be themselves, right? When Ford set up his factories, right? Classic Yankee experiment. He had all of these immigrants coming to work there, and he was like, well, you guys are acting strange and dressing strange. So we're going to have a night school for all the workers where they learn how to be Americans, how to, eat like Americans and use cutlery, how to dress and all the rest. And then they'd have a graduation ceremony where all the families would be invited and they'd have a gigantic paper mache melting pot. And all the workers were coming wearing their Hungarian national costumes and Czech national costumes and so on. And they'd walk in and then their teachers would be up on the top stirring the pot with giant spoons. And then suddenly they would come out graduating in their American suits, all matching, right? Hooray, everyone said they melted, right? That's not the same thing that we're talking about. So it required this mix of people. But today, could you snap your fingers and imagine it would be a lot more coherent to govern with two or three federations or confederations, just like the Civil War. Everyone thought it was going to break up into a Northern Confederacy, a Southern Confederacy, and a Middle Confederacy. And then the mayor of New York wanted to secede and start a city-state of New Netherlands. But that's kind of how the coherent thing in governing, where each national grouping would have a supermajority and govern the way they want. But I don't long for that because my experience in the Balkans and Bosnia, my shaping of the realities of human nature are not optimistic enough to think that that would be achieved without warfare and violence and all kinds of stuff. And if we broke up even without terrible destruction, suddenly think about the world without a United States, with a few rump states left over, right? The authoritarians out there, if you look through history, right? The United States has done many things wrong in foreign relations. When the United States isn't involved, things get much, much worse. there wouldn't be a United States there anymore. In fact, North America would become a continent for great power super competition, right? With different other powers backing different groups. In other words, it would be kind of a mess for the world and ourselves. I can't imagine a way where it would work out just the happy everyone, gets along and governs themselves. So I don't, but that's because of my, Balkans experience.
Thank you. Don't hear you talk, not hearing your books. I'm a devout patriot. I have ancestors that were part of the Revolutionary War. So I'm a patriot. I'm very liberal. Well, I guess I'm an American. I look at people that support Donald Trump, and they're patriots. And I'm a patriot. I raise the flag. But I have a question to you as an historian. What would our founding fathers, the folks that signed the Declaration of Independence, especially that in the Constitution, think about the Trumpers today? I think about this question all the time. What would they think about what's going on?
Well, I mean, the Trump movement, like in the January 6th form of things, right, is what the founders were worried about. The founders weren't really in on democracy. That came later when Greater Appalachia pushing everybody. They wanted a republic, and you couldn't trust that the democracy would run wild and be a dangerous force. So they were all worried about containing democracy with institutions. So what they were worried about, and a lot of them wrote about in the Federalist Papers, is exactly the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, right? And the misinformation bubble of people being swept up to believe who knows what. That was their fear. It was very classist and top down, but that's what they would have thought and been worried about. There should be a distinction, though. I think we haven't talked in this conversation about the sort of disinformation system that's at work. Remember, I said that maybe 10 or 20% of Americans are down on ethno-national authoritarianism, 20% at the most. I think it's more like 10 or maybe 8 if you really sat down with them. But, Donald Trump got what, 47, 48% of the vote in these elections? Most people who are voting for Trump and consider themselves Trump supporters aren't actually down for what the agenda would really be. But there's a gulf there because there's an entire misinformation ecosystem going that they don't realize that that's happening because we're living in these separate info bubbles. And that's a whole separate and difficult conversation. That's what I mean by, yeah, you won't convince everybody. You won't even convince all of the 70 or 80% who probably latently would agree with this national narrative. You can only get some because all of those forces are at work. But there's certainly 5, 10, 15% of people who are not only would they be against this, but are gettable and persuadable, I think, out there if approached with the American experiment as the offer.
What up?
I'm a big fan of the Press Herald. Thank you for posting this. And so I came tonight, I'm a simple person, and so he had a question, and I thought at the end of your talk I had a yes. At America Stadium.
Oh, the question to talk, right?
But it sounds like after your talk, so there's yes, there's likely, maybe, likely, no. So maybe you could just firm that up a little bit.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that I'm not sure if there's many people under the age of 40 here. And I'm concerned the messaging to the youth, if you're trying to gather what you're doing and get it out. You talk about all the strata, all these levels, but the young and old matter a lot. And I got a lot of faith in the future, so I got a lot of faith in youth. And I'm kind of curious your thoughts about messaging to them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big question is, can America stay together? Yes, we should. We need to, because I think the alternatives are worse. And I think we can and probably will. Is it possible that we won't and that things will collapse? Yes, that's the warning. Is like, do not be complacent. I do think, I give it 70-30 that it's going to ultimately turn out okay. It'll be bumpy and scary, but I think I do have a belief that will happen. But pulling ourselves together, having this, the flag that is America that you rally to, because the rest of us who aren't in on the authoritarian thing don't have that coherent thing to kind of wrap ourselves, to gather us together and give us a big 10 and a common purpose. We're all in different silos and kind of, disorganized. And we need to be organized around that set of principles. Liz Cheney to Liz Warren, everybody on board, right? So that's the first one. And the second part of your question was how to reach out to the young. I think they're hungry for this. I get a lot of audiences for American Nations and stuff 10 years ago were this demographic, but in the past 10 years, I've noticed a huge shift of Gen Zers and millennials coming in larger and larger portions to a lot of talks about this stuff, especially when it's on these sort of democratic survival kind of elements. So I think there's a ready audience there. All the polling and stuff on those generations is, their eyes are open. They're extremely concerned, and rightly so. And I think they want to act. The complacency element is not a problem for the younger generation. So I think the pitch to them, I have a feeling will be easier than to some other generations. I'm a Gen Xer, and I think there's more irony and cynicism that you have to get through than you would with people who are like, yeah, there's a total crisis. We need to do something about it, which I think is kind of where millennials and Gen Z are at. That's my instinct anyway.
The three branches of government include the judiciary. It's been decades in the works, but far right now wants to pull. What, if any, insights have you gleaned through your vision of what America looks like today with tribalism as it's reflected in the report and plan review? Because they are referees, and the referees have now basically been fought and paid for. That's one. Two is, where's your money coming from? And do you accept contributions? And the third is, what do you want us to do?
Sure. On the first element, funding, you distracted me with funding in that one. Working my way. Oh, the court.
Oh,
right.
the court.
The 9. Yeah, the court has a legitimacy problem, and rightly so at this point, right? That some of these seats were captured in ways that a lot of people don't think are entirely legitimate, and now the decisions they're making, the credibility of the court in public polling and everything is very low, and rightly so. That's a danger for the court. That's a danger for society because it's given a great deal of power, and if people think that it's just the partisan machinations that they make up a philosophy to go where they want politically, that's a really bad thing for the country, and that's kind of where we are right now. So can't control the constitutional order, right? It's all based on people with lifetime appointments. So that part we can't do a ton about at the moment, but it is indeed a problem. And originalist interpretations of the Constitution would shock the founding fathers, who write in all their writings about how the Constitution is obviously a living document. They put it together ad hoc. It needs to evolve with the times. We know that. So to build your philosophy on that is not helpful to the task of the American experiment. However, there's not that much the rest of us can do about that. You can, however, help fund Nationhood Lab in its work. All of our work is from individual donations. There's a donation button at the website. We have, moderately large donors all the way down to very small ones. And so it's, I guess, public finance, you could say. If you guys know people at, Carnegie and the like who want to give us giant grants, then that's great too. But we are all funded through individuals, and I guess you'd say people power of one sort or another. And yeah, check it out at Nationhood Lab. All of our stuff is up. Data journalism, scientific and research and academic papers we're publishing all the time at the same time, and updating people as the national narrative comes forward. And we'll be sharing the results and the scripts and what we learn, and entirely publicly. So as I said, the world's least secret PSYOP.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions.
Thank you so much. So I used to live in Yugoslavia too. And it's interesting because I lived in Slovenia. They said of the southern Slav Serbs, they said, they're more violent than us, they are a different religion than us, they're lazier than us, they eat different foods, it's unhealthy. And you just laid all of that out for us to the south. And so if interesting afterwards, but like, let's really work on stay together. Yes, they're more violent than us. Yes, they want to racist authoritarian caliphate. But if we didn't have them, we couldn't have an American empire where we were 20 years in Afghanistan, 20 years in Iraq, created genocide, Israel right now. So I just find it a little bit weird to say like, we desperately need to stay together. And these folks fundamentally have never had a balance.
I mean, the difference is Yugoslavia is not a giant continent spanning superpower with enormous influence on the rest of the planet and, you know, a massive arsenal, right? The consequences both of a unpeaceful breakup would be much larger here, and the consequences for the rest of the world of us breaking up are much larger. So, you know, those are among the reasons that I think they're a bit different in those respects. In Yugoslavia was, you know, the Slovenes feel that way because they were part of the Austrian crown lands, not just in the Habsburg Empire. They were sort of part of Greater Austria, and other places were in the Ottoman Empire. You know, the Yugoslav period is a blip in their history that they can look back in their narrative terms and say, well, that was a weird thing we were involved in. Whereas the United States, right, as a settler colonizer society, it kind of became, there's not a precedent to go backwards that gives you these regional cultures easily. So I hear what you're saying, but I don't think the lessons of Yugoslavia help us calculate whether or not we should stay together in the US now.
One more question?
So, regarding your work with the Nation Good Laugh, I admire and respect the dialogue that you developed. And immediately that came to mind when I was this 1776 curriculum that the Trump administration.
Yeah.
I imagine it's very different. Also hearing that you're shopping it to the television production world and movie production world and all like that. How do you then contrast this with the 1776 curriculum, and how do you combat the inevitable right-wing backlash that the Hollywood production and television production world is dominated by liberal elites?
No. I mean, we're not interacting or shopping it ourselves to Hollywood or that. Organizations that do that all the time will have our script and power their work. So we're one step removed from it. But I'd say your broader question, I mean, the American experiment, I think, gets you around the liberal conservative thing, right? I don't think there's a right-wing backlash to the Declaration. You can have a tiny sub-wing that's a backlash, but the Declaration, it's the most like sacred document thing we have in the American civic religion. And so to go against the Declaration's values, that's a really hard thing for anybody to really do. So I don't think you get a backlash like that if you ground it on those fundamental principles. There's all kinds of stuff that follows logically from those principles that can come later, but that's part of the give and take of the discussion after that. I don't think you can have a really significant backlash against the American experiment itself. 20%, yeah, but not a right-wing backlash in the 40-50% kind of way that you're alluding to. And the difference in 1776, I mean, it's fact-based, and a lot of the 1776 stuff really wasn't, right? I mean, read the document. It's out there on the web somewhere or another. The front of it seems, not shocking, but you get to the second half of it where they unroll the implications and what is and isn't true about American society and history. And yeah, it's we're based on evidence and fact, I think, is one of the things. And we're also not the federal government putting forward something that therefore can be implemented theoretically through the Department of Education, and you can't get your money unless you have this curriculum. We're not that, right? We're not empowered in that sense either, which makes it a very different proposition than something coming from the executive branch.
Okay, I think we have to wrap it up there, but I want to thank Colin.
Thank you all for coming.
And Colin will stick around for a while. He's got books in the back if you would like to have a chat with him and purchase a book. Before I let you all go, I'm going to mention some of our upcoming events in case you are interested. On Tuesday, the 16th, our food editor, Peggy Grodinsky, will sit down with Mary Lou Ranta, chef and owner of The Quarry in Monson. She won a James Beard Award last year. That's 7 p.m. at One Longfellow. And on Wednesday, May 1st, our CEO, Lisa DeSisto, will sit down with Mark Basir, director of the Portland Museum of Arts. That's 8 a.m. at the PMA on May 1st. So to get tickets and to stay on top of all of our upcoming events, go to pressherald.com/events. Thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Drive safe.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You want this sign or sign to somebody?
To Linda.
Oh, sure. For sure. Oh, awesome.
Of course. Thank you for coming.
Oh, my pleasure.
Oh, yeah. Don't look directly at the light. It's a little bright.
The number of the,
It doesn't seem like it.
Somebody
I
else
mean,
did that too.
the case is obviously so troubled as to should be thrown out. But you know, he's exhausted every possible avenue, and I guess nobody can do anything about it. Yeah, well, I mean, the DNA strongly suggests that he couldn't have been the person, and yet nobody's doing anything about it.